Good afternoon, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you so much for that clink. My name is David Birdsell, and the first thing that I have to say is that I am not Sandy Archibald, who has, alas, been laid low with the flu, so she has not made it past Seattle. But she asked me to step in and moderate today's program, which is titled, What Else Do MPP and MPA Graduates Need to Learn? Now, what else leads a lot of territory, and it also presupposes that we agree, as of course we agree, on every aspect of methods, on every aspect of a broad overview of the public sector that we all convey in our curricula. But the purpose of the panel really is to think about some of the softer skills, to think about how it is that we ensure student success, to try to think about how we constitute a set of expectations, both ethically and substantively, about who we want our graduates to be and what kind of image they project in professional life and in broader society. We have a terrific group of panelists to help us puzzle through these questions, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and at the same time to take a first crack at one of two broad baskets of questions that we have today. So the participants are, if we start all the way at the to my right, your left, are Andrew Light, who is with the U.S. Department of State and has a tenured position at George Mason University. Next to Andrew is Judith Fetter from Georgetown University. Next to Judy is, who is next to Judy, is Trevor Self of the International Monetary Fund, and please get him to share with you his picture of Karl Popper looking miserable. He showed that at the last presentation. And next to Trevor is Sam Myers from the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. So I'd like them to introduce themselves in that order and to begin to address this basic question about long-term success. How do we ensure for our graduates their advancement, their satisfaction, and as we heard, I thought, resonantly in the employer panel this morning, their ability to remain flexible to changing policy environments and changing work roles throughout the course of their careers. So we'll begin there, and we'll begin with Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and for the invitation to be on the panel this afternoon. I guess I was supposed to introduce myself a little bit. So at the State Department, I'm a senior advisor to the Special Envoy on Climate Change, which is the office that was created by Hillary Clinton at the beginning of this administration's last term as a new special office to lead all of our work, both in terms of negotiating the bilateral and multilateral climate agreements that the United States is engaged in, as well as oversee our development assistance portfolio with respect to mostly developing countries on climate assistance, which to date amounts to about $8.5 billion since 2010. I'm also an academic. It's too bad Sandy's not here because Sandy was my former dean when I was at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I was split between the School of Public Affairs and a Center for Values and Society there. At Mason, I'm jointly appointed to the School of Public Policy and the Philosophy Department, where I direct the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy. In answer to the question, so I want to speak, just to give you some context, and I'll make this quick, but I'm going to speak, this will be a little bit of an overlap with the earlier panel. I was flying back from something else this morning and just landed an hour ago. So I don't know if this will be completely duplicative of what you might have heard on the employers panel, but I would like to speak from the perspective somewhat of an employer as well to really address the question of what is owed to our students, but also having had the experience of having taught at a number of schools of public policy. And here I want to speak not only as a member of the administration now from the point of view of how we hire people at the State Department to do environmental policy and climate policy, but also prior to this appointment, I was with Judy, overlapped with Judy at the Center for American Progress, a think tank here many of you will know that was founded by John Podesta, former Chief of Staff to Bill Clinton, now back in the White House. And there I directed our international climate policy program. So between those two, and that's sort of been my Washington experience since 2008, I've probably been involved in hiring about, almost 24 people. Now I think, so I just want to make 3 points. The first one, and I'm going to speak from the perspective of environmental policy and now climate policy, is that a general background, I think, students emerging from schools of public policy with a general background in public administration or public policy, or even something more specialized with respect to nonprofit management, so thinking about the NGO world, is really not going to be very competitive on today's job market. There are just too many good people out there, too many people who have had very good level of experience already, even starting as undergrads, given the amazing variety of internships that are available for people, especially, again, speaking from the perspective of Washington. And in that respect, I think that we're going to have to endeavor you're going to serve your students best, and we're going to best create the competencies and qualities that we need for graduates if we really keep a close eye on what's really needed in the policy relevant fields. Now, I think there's actually a difference here. We can go into this later between environmental policy, which is quite mature, I think, and is actually delivering a lot of not only relevant research that's being picked up in the government and in the NGO world, and also very good skills for students, and climate policy, which has been kind of this slow burn, right, for a number of years, and now it's completely exploded. I mean, it's exploded as a major government initiative across the whole of government now in the United States. It is completely exploded all over the world. You have 20 years now of an ongoing major process, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where 198 countries work throughout the year and then culminate every year in a 2-week-long climate summit where they try to craft out international treaties. And then at last count, there was, if you count public and private initiatives, about a little north of $100 billion spent globally on climate-related financing around the world. So that just represents an awful lot of activity out there that's now happening. And essentially there, a student who emerges from a program who might have an interest in climate change, who's sort of interested in climate change, is just going to get beat out every time by someone who actually can say with much more specificity what part of the climate issue they want to. It is that fine grain now. Broadly speaking, 3 big categories: mitigation, which is trying to reduce emissions; adaptation, adapting to the changes in the planet that we've already sort of committed to, frankly, because of the warming we have now; and finance. And so in that respect, we really do need, you know, from the other side of the table, people who have clear specializations, or at least clearly intend to specialize in one of those areas. So my second point following on that is simply to say that honestly, when my interns over the years or junior staffers have come to me and who are undergrads and haven't yet gone to grad school, and they want to go to grad school, and they say, well, how can I kind of do the kind of stuff that you're doing now? I don't actually lead with go and get a graduate degree, get an MPP or an MPA, if it's the case that they have some kind of background or some capacity to do rigorous quantitative work in either a relevant science or in economics. If they have that capacity or the interest to develop those kinds of capacities, I say, look, you're really actually going to be much more competitive, frankly, if you go and do one of the many, many very good science policy, combined environmental science or climate science and science policy programs. MIT and a bunch of other places have great programs in this. Berkeley has a famous old one on this called ERG, the Environment and Resource Group, which just produces some of the best people in our field on the planet. Or get a master's degree in environmental economics, or go to a business school that has sort of a rigorous sort of program in understanding development finance. And they're just going to be more competitive, frankly, in our world, unless they have a lot of other kinds of experience to bolster a more general degree. If they don't have those kinds of those kinds of capacities, then I'm going to say you're going to do best if you actually go to a joint program, such as we had at the University of Washington. We had a number of joint programs between the Evans School there and the School of Fisheries, right, or the Evans School and the now College of the Environment there, or something where they're really going to get a very much more of an in-depth training in the field in addition to the things that we deliver in our best curriculums in public policy and public administration. Now, there are certainly a lot of good schools out there, the top-ranked schools in environmental policy who do this quite well. On the climate space, though, I don't think we've clearly distinguished what those top programs are yet, as opposed to in the law schools where they actually have emerged recently some of the law schools that really have specialized in climate law. And the final point then that I'll just make is that, and this is just old hat, obviously, but the importance of internships just can't be could never be overestimated in my mind. It's absolutely essential. And I think the trick we're going to have is that internships primarily, and we did this at Center for American Progress, if Judy or I wanted to actually bring in a master's student to be an intern, we had to fight like hell. Because that program is intended to bring along undergraduates, right, to give them the experiences where they can sort of figure out what they might want to do, rightly so. I mean, I think we'd all agree. So the question is, how do we sort of best create the opportunities for master's students that would not crowd out, potentially, the opportunities we want for undergraduates who are interested in these areas, so that they also can not only get the kinds of experiences that they want, but also figure out what is the part of the world with respect to environmental policy or climate policy that they want to go deep into and really try to make a name for themselves in. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Judy.
That's great. Well, thanks, Andrew. That was really a lot of meat there. I feel like stopping and we could just have a conversation on all of the material you put forward, but it's my job to put forward my own. So I am Judy Fader. I am the former dean of what's now, I'm proud to say, the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy. So very excited about that. And my field is health policy. And I've pursued it at Georgetown in and out of government and at various think tanks around town, including CAP and the Urban Institute. And I am pleased to be back with you all. I had spent quite a while. I forgot that little lapse I took while running for office, and I thank you all for your support. So, and I'd be in a different capacity speaking to you today had we been successful, but such is life. I'm going to speak from a different perspective. I think that the perspective that I bring, it reflects the stage of career that I'm at. And so what in answer to your specific framing, David, of how to enable our students to be satisfied, have advanced in their careers, and be flexible, feeling that I epitomize all those things, I'm going to speak from that perspective. And I think a lot of the, and I'm also taking that, we've agreed on all those other aspects of training, so I'm thinking of some other aspects other than the hard skills that we offer our students. Sort of in the skills realm, I would say that to enable policy students to achieve the objectives that you put forth, that from the get-go in our training, there needs to be sensitivity to the fact that policy is pursued in a political environment. And I don't think that is always the case. I think that frequently we focus so aggressively on methods training and on policy analysis that our students end up either dissatisfied, failing, or very frustrated because, oh my God, they have to do this in a political world. So from the beginning, I think that it is appropriate to be sensitive to the political environment as people pursue policy. I would extend that the idea of sensitivity more broadly to sensitivity to the small p political environments in which they operate, and their flexibility in navigating interpersonal environments. I think that a lot of success comes, we sometimes attribute it to luck, but I believe that it is more, you got to make luck. You got to recognize an opportunity when you see one, and I think enabling students to be sensitive to the people with whom they work and what opportunities they might actually pursue or recognize to move forward is a very important aspect of having successful careers. Moving on from that, I think it's also appropriate to encourage students' assertiveness in managing their careers, and I think there are multiple aspects of that. I guess prior to assertiveness, it is assertiveness. It is a reaching out. We call it networking. I find that a kind of yucky term, but it is essentially to actually look for assistance in terms of navigating their careers and finding the people who are going to open doors for them. I am amazed at the students who go into health policy without even asking me. That's very peculiar. And students who are who feel that it's inappropriate that they would be asking if I would assist in connecting them to various opportunities. That is, I don't know, maybe I was born with it, but it's weird to me, and it is much more prevalent than I would have thought. As far as I'm concerned, it's so absent in so many that students get credit for me if they manage to walk in the door. Anyway, I think that is something to consider. The assertiveness goes beyond that as people pursue the activities that I think will enable them to advance themselves. One student reminded me fairly recently that I told them that I shared with them that, you know, the idea, if somebody asks for something to be written, you want to raise your hand. You need to volunteer, you need to control the paper, you need to frame the arguments. Those kinds of skills, I think, are essential to success, advancement, and all the satisfaction as you laid out. So I would say, in terms of the ways that we teach those things, I think I would like to open that for broader discussion. I've seen some of you nodding and thinking about how to do that, but I would throw out a few. There's no question that having the speaking skills and writing skills are a sine qua non for going anywhere. So I think that in our teaching, integrated in all kinds of our courses, those skills need to be developed. I think that we also encourage those skills through mentoring, through our own mentoring of students, making it clear that they should come through the door for the kind of assistance that I'm talking about, for having our alums mentor current students. I think and then for alums mentoring each other, being part of a professional community, I think, is huge in terms of moving one's career forward and making a difference. And then I think that I would humbly say, I think we teach by example, and I will just leave that one at that.
Thanks. Trevor.
All right, I feel like I'm already ahead of the game, that nobody now, given the opportunity, has thrown food at me yet in response to my big data presentation earlier. So, my name is Trevor Self, and as was mentioned, I'm a program manager in organizational development and evaluation at the International Monetary Fund. My background is in,
It's on.
My background is in organizational psychology, statistics, and environmental policy. I'm not sure what good that does you in evaluating my comments, but there you go. I think I would underscore a lot of what's already been said, particularly what Judy just mentioned about maybe the first step of doing well in a career, whatever that ends up meaning to you, is recognizing at the forefront that you're in charge of what happens in your career. You are in charge of managing your career. And I think a lot of recent graduates aren't really aware of that they're used to going through degree programs and so forth where they are able to pick certain electives and so forth, but they're not really guiding that process. And so they've had a habit of going from A to B to C. And then when the world kind of opens up to them, I think many of them, from my experience, they expect somebody else to kind of hold their hand to go through it, and I think they need to realize that you're the one who has to lead that effort. I think I would also add a little bit of a humanistic perspective. Maybe this is the psychologist in me, but and this may go outside the bounds of what ends up being taught in public policy programs, but it seems pretty clear to me that whatever success is going to end up meaning to you, that's something you have to decide for yourself. So being successful in your career means knowing who you are. And I think many new graduates, many people in the midst of getting a graduate degree are caught up in, what do other people want me to be? What do I have to be? What do I have to know? What label do I have to put on myself in order for other people to want me? And that may work in the very near term once you get your degree. But you have to do something that you love, or you're going to burn out on that thing. And if you're constantly in the process of chasing after whatever you think is going to be new and whatever you think the next business cycle is going to make popular, you're going to be chasing fads your whole career, and that's a recipe, I think, for unhappiness. So I think it starts with knowing who you are and what you want to do and how you're going to make decisions about the value conflicts in your career, because those will come up. A minor point on a kind of a technical side, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to this. I think there was a carryover question from the morning plenary that this would relate to, but in terms of skills, I would say the ability to translate between disciplines is incredibly important. And if we get the chance to come back to that earlier question, I have a few disciplines in mind that I think it would be very helpful for people in general to know how to make those translations between the disciplines. But just in case we don't, I think that fundamentally you ought to be able to explain any public policy decision in a short amount of time to a member of the general public, and particularly a member of a group that you think is the most vulnerable group that you represent. And if you can't do that, I don't think that you're doing your job in public policy. So, and the fourth thing that I would add to this is just in terms of skill sets, critical thinking skills, and I particularly mean the notion of falsifiability. Those who were in the earlier talk will know I'm quite a fan of Karl Popper. Underscoring this notion that you have to always have in mind, how would we know if we were wrong? I think it's far too easy to get caught up in proving that you're right in a public policy environment, because there are so many other things at play that are trying to hinder your progress. But I think it's important to keep in mind, that real attachment to the fact that you might be wrong, or that situations might change that then make you wrong. So keeping that in the forefront of your mind, the notion of falsifiability.
Thanks, Trevor. Sam?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam Myers from the University of Minnesota. I come from a very insular profession. I'm an economist, and I live in two different worlds. I live in the world of applied microeconomics, where we spend a lot of time talking about causation and talking about identification. And this is the world where economists conflict sometimes with people in the policy world. And then I teach students who want to change the world. I teach students who want to spend their lives correcting problems of inequality, of injustice, and social wrongs. And they really, really don't want to do economics. And they don't want to do statistics, and they don't want to do math. But what they'd like to do is they'd like to get the credentials in order to be able to at least certify that, I'm a policy analyst. So the question I'd like to address is the question of, well, what is the key competency? What is it that the policy analyst needs to know? Now, we had a wonderful panel earlier this morning of employers, and the employees gave us a litany of things, and I took note about what it is that the employees want. But the economists in me suggest that, well, the answers that you're getting this morning are very much framed by a dynamic that goes on with respect to what we teach in the schools. So the reason why people are saying we need X, Y, and Z is that the schools are producing W, R, and T. And so I want to be clear about the bigger issue of solving problems in society. Not just the things that Mathematica or Manpower Development Research Corporation said this morning that they need, but what we need in society. What John Conyers, who was my boss when I was on the House Subcommittee on Crime, said to me that he needs. And that's problem structuring skills. Much of the competencies that we focus on in policy analysis programs and public policy programs are technical skills to answer the question once the question has been properly formulated. Too often, particularly in my main profession as an economist, we don't particularly care about the structure of the problem. The structure of the problem is kind of presumed the problem's out there. Doesn't matter whether or not John Conyers or somebody else thinks it's a problem. What matters is that it's a mountain out there, we need to climb it. It turns out that the John Conyers of the world matter. Whether or not you like it, the Judy Vetters of the world matter. And so at some point we need to confront the question of translating the skills and tools that purportedly are included in our empirical analysis classes into something that is along the lines of what is the problem. And so let's try to be clear that this is not a soft skill, saying what is the problem? Who are the stakeholders? Who thinks about this problem, thinks it's an important problem? It is actually an extraordinarily complex technical phenomenon. The dilemma is that we don't have a textbook. There's no textbook called How Do You Problem Structure. Well, I mean, I use Eugene Bardoc's book, and some students say I love it, and some students say, well, this says dumbed down, policy analysis. So it's kind of like a big gulf between what we think we need, and that is technical skills and problem structuring, and the methodologies and the teaching materials that we use in order to produce it. Now, later in today's discussion, see, this is just the question of what do we need to do? What are the competencies? Later in the discussion, I hope we will return to the question of how do we do it?
This gives us a lot to chew on. Trevor referred to the question that came out earlier in the panel that Doug led this morning, and that was how do we teach writing skills, which I might broaden to communication skills more generally, and which I think at least three of our panelists have broadened further to include interpersonal competencies and a keen attention to people who will suffer for better or for worse the consequences of whatever policies we recommend, should they ever be adopted by the John Conyers and others, should we deign to speak to them in language that they can understand and recommend policies that they can actually enact. So let me ask this question about pedagogy. How do we frame and should we take on as our burden in policy and management programs the goal of essentially, it seems to me, educating round citizens who want to project the values of a profession and are attentive to all of the people who will consume and be affected by policy? And Judy, let me start with you, and then we'll move down the table and pick up Andrew at the end.
Well, the short answer to the should we seems to me absolutely, but I would take it back a step. I think we all do this to some degree, but perhaps it needs to be stronger. I would say that we need to make clear that students need to be attentive to their own values as they pursue analysis. And this is, I think, obvious, and we do have good texts on this and a lot of experience with it. But I think that sometimes the technical overrides the sense of values, and that gets buried. And so I would say both in terms of one's own values and recognizing differences in values, being able to elevate the discussion so that those issues can be addressed, and making students comfortable with them would be very much a part of our educational mission.
Trevor, does this in any way bear on what you talked about and building exactly on what Judy just talked about, recognizing your own value sets and marching it into the curriculum from the learner's point of view?
Yes.
That was good. That was good.
Let's see. There was a lot packed into the first question that you asked. What stood out to me, though, if I heard you correctly, was a comment about projecting the values of the profession. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, part of my work, a large part of my work is on decentralized governance structures. So the idea of projecting values into other communities or standardizing systems at a higher level, I think that causes me some concern sometimes. And I think that many times in public policy, it's easy to get caught up in thinking, well, I've done this in all these other situations, and now it's just a matter of applying what I've learned in these situations to this situation, and I need to teach these people what they need to do, or something along those lines. But we have to value them in their own right, and it's a matter of helping them discern what their values are, what their goals are, and to the extent that you can bring those into alignment, then to help them accomplish those goals. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a matter of projecting the values of the profession, but facilitating the alignment of the profession's goals, and I would argue multiple professions. I'm not a big fan of silos either. So when we talk about the values of a profession, I think it's more a matter of seeing which professions are relevant to a given situation and looking at the values that those professions bring to bear. So it's maybe a complicated question to answer to your question.
Thank you.
So let's be honest. We're not dentists. So dentists have a set of professional values. The pharmacists have a set of professional values. The lawyers, well, there's a website I can go to determine whether or not the lawyers have complied with those values to the extent that you become disbarred. I can tell you whether or not you're censored, whether or not you have appealed to censorship, whether or not you've been, your license has been revoked. But we're not lawyers, we're not dentists, we're not pharmacists. To the best of my knowledge, no state regulates public administrators or policy analysts. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have a document that we sign. Well, at least maybe some. I don't have to sign a conflict of interest document. But that's for my research. That's for the IRB. But once we unleash all of these smart, energetic, imaginative people who are called policy analysts, they're not bound to some common set of professional ethics. And so the question is, should they be? And the answer is, if the answer is yes, then who will be responsible for it? Lawyers, and the good thing about pharmacists is that themselves committed themselves to those standards of ethics, of professional responsibility. My problem is I've never been exposed to the training and the necessary preparation to teach the students, to require them to adhere to a set of standards. Then shouldn't you first teach me what those standards happen to be? So I want to clarify that the question you're asking is about something that hasn't whether or not we should have some sort of common metric and language. In fact, you used the term, not you, but Sandy used the term that Judy and I were talking about. It's, we don't know what this means.
That term is professional citizenship, by the way.
Incidentally, on that note, I do have a contractual obligation to tell you that I'm here in a personal capacity, and my opinions are not those of you.
Thank you for reminding me, Trevor, that I was supposed to say that as well. Right. So a couple things, like one, just answering the bigger question, and maybe a second answer, which goes and tries to take up the particular challenge that Sam just put in front of us. I have been unfortunately involved in my career in trying to produce codes of professional ethics for various disciplines, which have all been some of the most boring things I've ever been involved with in my entire life, because it's hard to say anything interesting when you're doing that at all. And also, it just sort of is effectively, it's just, I never actually, for the life of me, believed, and this is things like, I did a code of professional ethics for environmental epidemiologists, and I'm quite sure that no environmental epidemiologist has ever laid eyes on this document, and actually it's impacted what they've ever done. It's a long story, but when you're a postdoc, you do right. Okay, so, but let me just say that I do disagree a little bit with some of what Sam said. I mean, I think that some of our students, there seems to be, there must be a way in which you can raise the possibility, right? Those of you who either intend to want to be involved in public service, right? Really public service, working for the government at some level, or you want to think about, what it would be like if you wound up in that. I do think that in a democratic society, there are, broadly speaking, some minimal levels of professional responsibility that we can articulate without actually having to go through the pedantic exercise of doing a code of ethics. And I mean, certainly included in that, and engineers have really done, I think, an amazing job over the last 25 years of really internalizing this into their discipline. And they did it the hard way, like after lots of people died in very unfortunate accidents, it became apparent that they had to do this. The National Science Foundation put a lot of money into it. But just talking about the importance of transparency and accountability, and then thirdly, we sometimes call it whistleblowing, but essentially, what Trevor was sort of, I think, part of what Trevor was suggesting earlier, taking into account the fact that you have to look at how the least well-off, right, might be impacted by your policies, and flagging that, right, if no one's paying attention to it. I mean, at least from the perspective of being an actual civil servant, I think that there's definitely room for that. There's a more specific answer, and I won't go into this unless people have questions for it later, but you can just, park it and think about it later. I think there's an additional criteria you could lay on that in the realm of science policy. And particularly I think about this obviously in the context of climate policy, where on the one hand I think there is an absolute necessity of getting people who are interested in these issues to understand that they have to have enough facility with the science to know what the physical constraints are with the issues that they're dealing with, but more importantly, not to engage, there's a spillover in the other direction in the science policy world where there is this overwhelming and overabiding fear of the normative, right? The idea that you must absolutely never go beyond simply describing a problem or describing the options for how a policy response could be formulated in response to a problem, and never cross the line into policy prescription, as if we don't do that all the time anyway, which we do. And finally, I guess on this, and this is the last thing I'll say on it, is, again, just teeing off of something that Sam said, and this is a question that one of the questions that Sandy was interested in is whether or not should courses on ethics or normative analysis be required in schools of public policy. Again, maybe save that for discussion. But I have some considered views on this because I've taught those kinds of courses before. I think that fundamentally courses on ethics writ large in schools of public policy, ethical theory, for example, are quite useless. I don't think they reach the students. I don't think they're taken seriously by the students. I don't think they actually speak to the needs of the students when they actually get out of school and are in the working world. If you can do very specific classes that are policy relevant, and not only just policy relevant generally speaking, but really specific to particular areas of strength, right? Ethics and environmental policy, ethics and health policy, these kinds of things. That's a good way to go about that in order to raise these kinds of questions. If I were dean, right, and I had to make hard choices about whether or not to spend resources to bring in someone specially to teach those classes, or actually hire people who are experts in policy, who also understand the normative questions, I would go the latter direction, frankly, for schools of public policy. Because I think that too many folks who do normative analysis of these areas of public policy without actually working in those areas of public policy don't actually understand the constraints and the details and the nuances of how these moral questions evolve actually on the ground.
That's an important counterpoint. We were actually watching Laurel McFarland's blood pressure going up as we were laying waste to public service values, which is at the core of NASPA accreditation. But they're now back firmly ensconced in the firmament. I'm going to ask one more question, but I'd like to encourage you to begin approaching the microphones because we'll be going out to questions from the floor and from the members of the audience who are joining us online. So my question is this. We have talked around a variety of ways, and some of us were talking just before the panel began, about the importance of communication. We've heard it in terms of how people relate interpersonally to one another, how people are able to convey disciplinary knowledge from one discipline to another in a necessarily interdisciplinary environment, how people are able to convey the fruits of policy analysis to policy actors, etc. And going back to that morning question about how we teach writing and more broadly how we teach communication, do we do that in these schools? How do we do it? And I'm asking actually for some very practical recommendations, panelists. How do we do that? And if we don't do it, is it a question of undervaluing that, or is it just sheerly the time pressure on curriculum? You can't do everything. Sam, can we start with you?
So first of all, I agree with everything that was said this morning about the importance of knowing how to write brief, concise policy briefs, policy memos, something that a congressman can digest while they're going down the elevator. But by the way, they're not going to read it, so it means that you need to be able to communicate it, be able to get your point across very quickly. But I want to remind us that the policy brief, the policy memorandum is not an end. It's a means to an end, and it's a means toward communicating knowledge, communicating information. And the dilemma is that if the information is based on evidence that has been poorly assembled, if it's based on evidence that it could easily be refuted, then no matter how beautifully it's written, it ends up being nothing more than an advocacy document. And so are we really interested in producing advocates? Are we interested in producing analysts? And so I'd like to add to the conversation the word evidence. Okay, so we have an empirical analysis class. And increasingly, empirical analysis class is heavily weighted toward regression analysis. And regression analysis is heavily weighted toward the analysis of secondary data, analysis of things that have already happened. The problem with regression analysis is just a tool. I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist in order to be able to put up a graph, to do the trend, identify what the slopes are. So what's the purpose? The purpose is to gather evidence. In law schools, we have a course called evidence. But in schools of public policy, we call it statistics, probability, empirical analysis. And so what is evidence? Does evidence include qualitative information? Does evidence include information that comes from marginalized stakeholders? I mean, you know, I hope you're aware of the fact that if you do a telephone survey and it's based on a physical location, you're going to miss a large number of Latinos in America because Latinos disproportionately use cell phones. If you use a telephone survey that's based on the assumption that it's a private phone, you're going to miss all the people on reservations because people on reservations disproportionately use the telephone that's a public telephone. Okay, so this is something about evidence. This is something about the knowledge that we're gaining from the information that we're collecting. I would argue that these multiple sources of knowledge about the people that we're trying to examine ought to be a part of our curriculum, and it shouldn't be kind of put in these buckets, the qualitative analysis bucket, the quantitative analysis bucket, the forecasting bucket, but rather it should be something called policy evidence.
Powerful.
Wow, you said a lot. Let's see. I agree about the focus on evidence. I would hasten to add, I just got done talking about big data and a lot of concerns that I have about big data and its use in public policy. But I would hasten to add that there's a difference between data and evidence. And maybe this is what you're getting at, Sam, to some extent, that talking about the quantitative and the qualitative and how we fit these things together. I worry when institutions begin to focus on data in and of itself, when they take data as being, as having just come out of the ether and take it at face value. And particularly when we teach statistics as the primary tool of policy analysis. I mean, we ought to be concerned first and foremost, I think, with interpretation, and then secondarily with methods, and then with statistics and tools. Interpretation is always more important than methods, which is always more important than statistics. Garbage in, garbage out. And when we concentrate on numbers, I don't want to, as I said, go too much into what I covered in the earlier talk, but I worry about alienating certain groups. Data are a very crude vocabulary for describing the phenomena that are of interest to us in public policy. So I worry about speaking only in that vocabulary. So
I'm going to take this in adds a different dimension to this conversation, one that we were discussing earlier, and go back to your question, David, about communicating in writing or out loud to the policy world, if I understood it correctly. And I would observe that a view that I've had from my early experience with policy schools was that our faculty is sometimes less interested in that than one might think, given that we are in a policy world. I will go one step further and kind of perhaps push some buttons to say that our faculty do not always have the respect for the professions, for the careers paths that our students take, that I believe they ought to have, because they are, after all, academics, and master's students are not going in that direction. And I think that is undermining of our ability to both educate and support our students as they go forward in their careers to take on this critical task. So I think that's worth discussing and is a challenge. I would also say that independent of teaching, working with academics and researchers who think that the political world is a disaster and want to keep it, stay as far from it as they're able, I think there's another problem, and that is that I do believe that not all researchers, not all academics are either suited to or desirous of taking their research, really making it useful for policy, even when it may have, it may fundamentally have some utility. And I think that's okay, because I think there are others in our community, speaking personally, who are happy to take it forward for them. What I think is unacceptable, and I think is malpractice, policy analyst malpractice, is when researchers produce their work without consideration of how its results will be used in the policy debate. Because what I've told many groups is that if you don't use it, somebody else will. And therefore, you ought to do the best you can to be aware of that and assert in your own work how what its limitations are and what its value is. So I think that those comments are somewhat relevant to the question, and I thought might stimulate some conversation. So there you are.
Thank you. So I'll just end this round with just some practical examples, right, which I think of embody. Again, these are the ones that I know from the circles that I travel in, where you actually see schools of public policy have been quite successful in getting their ideas, not only getting their ideas out, the research, but since we're looking at students here, providing incredibly interesting opportunities for students to engage in this process, to actually not see this as a choice, either policy or politics, to engage with them both at the same time and actually see how these things work. There are some institutions who have been fortunate enough to be able to sink resources into doing this. Frankly, it takes a lot of work and a lot of training, no matter how good your writing skills are, no matter how good your interpersonal skills are, to learn how you take academic research and turn it into something that actually can be consumed, you know, by people in institutions like the one that I work in now. Some of the examples where, you know, schools of public policy have set up operations with staffed by professionals to do this have been enormously successful. I would sort of say one was when Duke started the Nicholas School of the Environment. They established a center for environmental policy here in Washington, shared space with resources for the future, staffed that independently with people, just a couple of people who were incredibly effective at taking the research from the Nicholas School and then actually delivering it to Congress, wound up really crafting very key parts of the Waxman-Markey climate legislation in 2009, being enormously influential. Secondly, Robert Stavins, if you work in the field of climate policy, you'll know, incredibly talented environmental economist at the Kennedy School, has started the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. And they've just got it soup to nuts. Just go to their website and you can kind of see, like, they don't say anything. They don't produce any articles unless they've got a two-pager there ready to download. And then Robert goes with his students to all the big climate meetings around the world, comms person in hand, right, to go to party to party to party to different country parties, finding out what they want, seeing if, in fact, he's got something literally in his bag that can help them resolve a problem that they're facing right there, and then essentially offering his services to work out details of on-the-ground puzzles that are happening or problems that are happening in the middle of the negotiations. Now, again, that takes resources. But beyond that, the second level of this are the schools that have established collaborations. I think one of the most interesting there are the emerging collaborations between universities and think tanks here in Washington. And this is also this is a long history of this actually happening in Brussels with the EU, much longer than here. More of a recent phenomenon in Washington, but look at the collaboration there. I would implore you to look at the collaboration between Arizona State University, always very innovative in these circles, and the New America Foundation, especially on science policy. They also have a presence in Washington in the Consortium on Science Policy Outcomes run by a guy named Dan Sarowitz. But they also, just the collaboration alone has yielded some fruit. We are now in the process now of creating a joint Center for Climate Adaptation between the Center for American Progress and George Mason University. Given the reputations of both institutions, this will be a nice sort of strange bedfellows, right, collaboration. Should tweak a few noses on that. And there we really are kind of like taking the analytical capacity of the university from science all the way to communications, including the ability to do polling, this kind of thing, and connecting it to the politically driven policy expertise at the Center for American Progress. And beyond those also take some resources, but you can actually start these with very little commitment, just the sweat equity of collaborating. There are a number of consortia among different universities, I think specialists among different universities that we've seen, especially again on the science and engineering side, where you get a sort of a regional consortium which will all contribute a little bit into creating some kind of outreach effort to help to bring the stuff across, and then create your own internships through that process, right? Rather than relying on some other institution to create the internships for your students to apply to, you create the own ones that are dedicated to your students and your students alone. And that, in fact, is a very good model for closing the loop on the comments that I started with.
Thank you. Some terrific ideas, some great examples. Pardon me, this is now the time for you to pose your questions to the panelists. If you can just let us know who you are and whether your question is to the panel generally or to one member of it.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Colombo. I am coming from Italy. And I crossed the ocean for one simple reason, and thank you for being here, for being with you, because probably you're not completely aware how lucky you are here. Because you at least can talk about policy analysis, and you know what it means, roughly, but you know what it means. When you talk to policy analysis in Italy, you talk about, that discipline that explains you how things should be done. Okay? But nobody's talking about how to help people do this. So starting from this point, I work in the Institute for Research, Statistics and Training for the regional government in Milan, in the north of Italy. And after years of lacking these competencies, we want to start a PhD program. So I'm going to ask you two, let me say, stupid questions, very briefly. Also because, unfortunately, I'm not American, so I probably wrong. The first one is, please don't laugh, is what is the difference between a master program and a PhD program? And the second stupid question is, what is the difference between the job that we as researchers do and the job of consultancies?
Those are very good questions. Panel?
Well, I will take a first shot, and then, Alessandro, where have you gone? They're going to laugh at me. Your questions were perfectly legitimate, but I'm going to put it out there. In terms of simple answers to your question, the difference between a master's degree and a PhD, a master's degree is I think, a professional degree for the practice of policy. So a master's in public policy, our students go into government, into nonprofit organizations, into consulting firms in order to be involved in the policy that an area of policy that interests them, applying their skills. Whereas a PhD is an engagement, a training in, a mastery of scholarship in a particular field, involving much more intensive academic research, taking longer, and perhaps not equipping you to go into the practice of the policy, but being more equipped to do do the research in a particular area. Thank God people are nodding. It was a gamble for me. The difference that I would put forward between, you asked between a consultant and, I forgot what you labeled, and a consultant research. Consultants are very client-oriented. They are supposed to presumably use research to address a client's question, but their whole orientation is to serve the client. And some would say, I might venture, that not always where the research leads, but to where the client's interest leads. I'm sure that's a bit of an overstepping. The pace at which they work is mind-boggling to researchers, because they work very fast and operate in a very different environment from an academic research environment, where the goal is to find the truth, to ask your own questions, and take you where the evidence leads you to a considerable extent. Does not mean that academics can't be consultants. Many are, but it's a different kind of, you start with a different set of questions, a different set of end goals, and usually operate at a very different pace.
Andrew? Well, I mean, one quick thing on that is that this is actually a very interesting issue, is the culture of doctoral degrees, right, comparatively across different countries. And so, I mean, I don't know Italy, but I do know that there are some European countries where, in fact, a doctorate is more kind of a necessary, or let's say not necessary, but certainly more ubiquitous in the civil service as a degree for certain levels of career advancement. And so it can very well be the case, depending on where you are, that there would be less of a distinction, right, between a master's and a PhD or a doctorate. I think, frankly, I don't know if any of you like Kurt Vonnegut, but Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano, was, I think, one of the most brilliant things he ever did, and describes a not too distant world, actually from the past now, where you have to have a PhD to become a real estate agent and a car salesman and like everything else. And so we may actually get there in this country eventually,
heaven,
but thank God not yet.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is not set up for people who are vertically challenged. My name is Nina Estrella Luna. I teach at Northeastern University, and I have just two comments. One a suggestion and then one a bit of a challenge for you to reflect on. One on the issue of the professional ethics. I have I guess you can call it the privilege of developing my program's mission and value statement. This was all part of our accreditation process. And the value statement being kind of a controversial thing to think about. One of the things that we came down to and are kind of holding on to consider, in addition to what was discussed around accountability, transparency, consideration of the most vulnerable, all values that I certainly agree with, but also undervaluing the role of government in solving social problems. And that was actually kind of controversial, and certainly I just happened to be lucky that I got it in the document. So somebody didn't read the full mission statement. So just to put it out there for your reflection, the challenge.
So much for transparency.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes transparency is good, and sometimes it's not. The challenge that I want to present to you really has to do with the statement that was made that you are in charge of what happens in your career, and the notion of being assertive in pursuing your careers. And it's not that I disagree with that, but let's be honest. The research shows, the evidence shows that is not necessarily the case for women and for people of color in any profession, and particularly in the policy world. And so the University of Michigan actually has a really great mentoring guide for faculty, and one of the things that they include in that is how do you go about thinking about mentoring and actually trying to be successful in mentoring the so-called non-traditional students. So to me, this is important because, I'm a first-generation Latino and, first in my family to go to college. And so the notion that this idea of being assertive in pursuing your career and networking and all that is completely contrary to the cultural values that I come from. And so I think we need to be sensitive to what that means. And I want to challenge the notion that you can be in control of your career, because quite frankly, my experience has been that I haven't necessarily been in charge of my career because other people have had to open doors for me. It's not necessarily that those doors, I was able to choose the doors for me. And I'm luckier than most because I happen to, benefit from white privilege within my cultural group. So I think we want to think about what that means before we make those kinds of claims, those universal claims.
Why don't we start with Trevor, since you talked about the intentional career, and then anybody else please join in.
Yeah, so first of all, I wouldn't say that you're vertically challenged, maybe just gravitationally enhanced. So, yeah. The point that I was making was more about what good it does to giving advice to people who are early in their careers. So I think it does more good for those people to focus on the kind of empowerment that they can have in directing their careers. Taking a point that was made, I think, in a presentation I gave earlier about what's the counterfactual, that would we say to someone, well, just wait. Wait for something good to happen. I don't think that that's very empowering or useful for those individuals. So my focus would be to them, find out where you have leverage, find out what realize what you want to do, and then make use of that. And if there are, I've done a decent amount of work with different types of disadvantaged groups, so I have strong sympathies with people who have an uphill battle in different situations, but it doesn't seem to help if you externalize it to say, what can I do? I think the focus has to be on what's within your control. So I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but I wouldn't just throw up the white flag for it.
Sam?
Okay, so this is the hot potato here, and so you've actually raised the issue of privilege. And the first thing I tell my students, who are largely white, upper class, from elite colleges, is that you're privileged. I'm teaching policy analysis, and I'm saying policy analysis is privileging. The tools and techniques are privileging. Of course, I get in trouble when I say that, so I have to try to explain what we mean by privilege. And so it's actually helpful to get people privileging to us. You say, well, how privileged are you? Somebody says, I grew up in a trailer park. I'm not privileged. Someone says, I grew up in the inner city of Detroit. I'm not privileged. But the fact that you're at the University of Minnesota or at Michigan or George Washington or Georgetown, number one, that means you're privileged. And so in some ways, the way we are, putting forth the tools and skills as this was transparent, it's accountable, it's objective, it's arm's length, is a lie. It really is the case that we are perpetuating and reproducing privilege. But the best thing I can do in the classroom is to begin the class by saying, you're privileged. This is a privileging, technique. And it's really important for you to know the moment that you begin to look at earned income tax credits, or you begin to look at, who drops out of the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, you need to know that you, as an analyst, walk into the analysis as a privileged individual.
Okay. Why don't we go to the west mic here, and both gentlemen have been standing for a bit, so why don't we get both Michael and Larry. We won't punish you, Larry, for your queuing problems here instead of coming over there, and we'll end with Laurel. And we do have one from the web. Okay.
So hi, I'm Michael here from UC Berkeley. On this issue of taking charge and, pushing your career forward and so on, just two thoughts I wanted to share about that. One of them is my friend Bob Frank has some really eloquent and interesting discussion about the role of chance and how your career in life unfolds, and the role is a lot bigger than most people would like to admit, which is probably okay. I tell my students that they have several careers before them that are very, very different, but it's a flat optimum. And they ought to be more alert than students tend to be to the opportunities the world just drops in front of them that they never thought to ask for. Because sometimes in its own stupid way, the world has a better idea of how you can create value than you do. And if if you sort of have your ears open for that, it's not a bad idea. On the question of ethics and professional ethics and so on, two observations. One is that to have a professional code of ethics is is not only a two-edged sword, but can be a source of enormous mischief. To have a written code of ethics, and I would caution everyone in this business to be careful what you wish for. Writing one, it's like a mission statement. Writing a mission statement is often a good exercise for an organization to be in, and having a mission statement is usually not very useful and doesn't actually help make decisions. Maybe that's the way to think about it, but Mark Moore used to ask students, so whose values are you going into the public service to advance? And it's a really important question because the instinctive answer is mine. And then when you think about it a little more, you say, wait a minute. Maybe there's learning about values and not just about how to do it. Okay, so my last question, a question I really want to put to the panel, comes from Sam's suggestion that it may be the case that there is real usable knowledge that's not captured in a p less than 0.05 regression coefficient. And if there is such knowledge, how do you put it to work in a systematic way? And I know what the answer to that is, and it's Bayesian inference. But I haven't heard the name of Bayes or the phrase used yet today as a curriculum element. That when we talk about statistics, we're almost always talking about classical inferential statistics, where you either know for sure, or you know nothing, and I don't know what it means to know nothing, but what do you guys think about putting that whole body of systematic inferential process back into our curriculum, from which it has fallen in most of the schools known to me, but I don't know, I could be wrong. Maybe we're all doing it and I haven't noticed.
Panel?
Are you asking about the value of incorporating Bayesian statistics into public policy? Yes. Personally, I think there's a great deal of value there. However, I would, given the limited amount of time and resources that these programs probably have, I'm not sure I would put it at the top of the list. It might be more useful than some inferential statistics, being able to take into account what the existing population parameters are. I wouldn't put it ahead of interpretation and methods. I might put it ahead of, as you said, regression analyses. And I would probably put ahead of Bayesian the concept of effect sizes and confidence intervals and things like that. But Bayesian, I think, would certainly be useful.
I'd put it extremely high, especially in the environmental realm and in climate policy. It's absolutely critical. Fortunately, I spent my 3 years as a postdoc not writing codes of ethics, but primarily doing risk analysis on tar sands in Alberta. I was at the University of Alberta doing a postdoc, and mostly I was doing risk analysis on the tar sands in Alberta, and I really wish I'd kept with that. I got so sick of it. I said, I'll never, ever look at the tar sands again. If I'd stayed with that, I would be the most sought-after commentator in America, right? But I was stupid, right? But mostly we were using Bayesian techniques, and it's just absolutely valuable. So, and you actually, what we'll see, just for those of you who in this realm right now, we're sort of hours away from finalizing in Berlin the Working Group 3's report of the 5th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world body that is the most authoritative on looking at climate change. Working Group 3 is all about mitigation, and there's going to be a very strong opening because of that report for actually looking back at these tools.
One short follow-up statement. If you do choose to take that route, and I do think there's real value in teaching Bayesian statistics, I think it's important to couple it with a Popperian view of falsifiability and the importance of falsifiability, because Bayesian statistics can put a heavy weight on priors, right? So what your prior assumptions are when you come into the statistics can heavily determine what those outcomes are. So I think that there's a danger there of confirmation bias. So if you're going to go that route, I think you have to temper it with a very Popperian view.
We are down to about 4 minutes, and we have as many questions as we have minutes. So if I could ask you please to make them as short as you can.
Let me return to the writing problem. This morning we all said writing was critical to successful careers. It's my sense the university now does practically nothing to teach writing. We may value it and score it high when we encounter it, but we don't actually spend effort to fix the writing problems students have. One problem is that faculty have no incentive to worry about writing quality. It doesn't affect their own work, which is more important to them. We might say we turn it over to teaching assistants, but they often don't write well themselves. Many of them are foreign students who don't speak English well, so they can't do it. Programs of writing have been established at most universities to try to address the writing problem. But the writing teachers have other goals than fixing the low-level grammar problems, which are the real difficulty. They want to promote writing in higher-level senses that are more theoretical. What nobody wants to do is the close focus on the actual correcting of the bad grammar and usage that we encounter in actual papers. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody has an incentive to do it. And I see this as a systemic problem. The only answer I've found is to do it myself in my own courses, and I don't have very many students, so I can do it. But how do we do this on a large scale? That's what we really have to worry about.
Good point. Sam?
So I guess I'm fortunate by being in Minnesota. I don't have a problem of students who can't write. There's something about the selection process that highly skews the population of people who come to the University of Minnesota toward people who have extraordinary writing skills. The problem is that good writing is not the same as clear thinking. Good writing is not the same as problem structure and doing good policy analysis. So in a way, so we have been kind of drawing people from the Coltons, the McAllisters, the Yale College. I mean, we got a whole bunch of people who've been spending all of their years from their AP literature class in high school, to their senior thesis in college doing writing. Two problems associated with misinterpreting, grammar and stylistic errors. The first is that we undervalue people who can speak and who can think, but who, because of the poor high schools they went to, because of the public, universities and colleges they went to, disproportionately appear not to be able to write. So they're smart, they think well, and there's something about their writing that causes them not to get admitted to the University of Minnesota. And as a result, we end up having a very low share of students who come from communities in South Central Los Angeles or from Anacostia, Washington, and so forth. But the other part of it is overvaluing those people who have stylistically, grammatically correct writing, but who haven't really said anything.
We are just about out of time here. Do we have time to hear all of the questions and get one omnibus response? I'll take that as a yes. What is the, Laurel, if you could have your question, and then we'll go to the web question, Dahlia, yours, and then final remarks from the panel, and we're over.
Okay. I think both this panel and the morning plenary were a very good argument. I think that our schools should encourage evidence-based recruitment and selection for our field, and that I think there are many testable questions that you all have brought up today and this morning about how important is a joint degree. Is that are high-impact individuals in policy settings and so forth more effective if they have that? Are they more effective? Are we using writing in the selection process? Are we asking, are employers asking folks to do timed writing, or are they actually reading the writing samples that people are submitting and so forth? And I would just encourage us as schools, as a field, to promote evidence-based selection and recruitment so that we can actually move forward.
Championing our values. Thank you. Ben, what is the question from online?
This is from John, an MPA student at Virginia Tech. He wanted to know what type of certification and hard skills are useful to MPA grads that will make them more marketable. He's thinking of GIS, the Certified Government Financial Manager, Certified Internal Auditor, et cetera.
Thank you very much. Dahlia, and then we'll get last remarks from the panel.
Dahlia Remla from Burke College. These are really comments about teaching research and analysis. This is a response to Stan Myers. That's exactly right. We need to conceptualize this, not so much as teaching statistics, but teaching the research and analysis to get to the evidence. And I teach my students, whenever you hear we have survey evidence, the first thing that should come to mind is, who did you want to be that? Who's in your population that isn't in systematically and on the effect? So I think that we really need to conceptualize research analysis that way. On Bayesian stuff, I always like to say everyone should be a Bayesian in principle qualitatively. The actual specific Bayesian statistics is pretty difficult lift.
Thank you very much. Panelists, any final thoughts and anything on the competency question from our webinar participant at Virginia Tech?
I don't have anything on the web question, but there was an earlier statement. You had part of an earlier question about practical things that could be done related to communication. I didn't mean to dodge that. I think one of the important things maybe to understand is that communication isn't about what you communicate, it's about what's understood. And I think many of the people that I've seen hired into public policy come in with thinking that it's about the process of communicating rather than the process of being understood. And those are two different things. And as a practical matter, I think what can really help with that is going through it just practically public policy 101, drawing a stakeholder map and putting yourself in the shoes of one of those stakeholder groups and attempting to communicate some policy perspective to another one of those stakeholder groups, to cross disciplines, to cross those stakeholder interests, and then to have somebody listen to that and tell you what they heard. And if what they heard is different from what you meant, then that's a feedback loop that allows for correction. And I think that's a very useful process that I've seen work in several instances.
Sam has the last word.
I'd like to address our distinguished colleague visiting from Italy.
He's back in Italy.
And our guests at home who are watching,
there,
on the computers. The Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management was formed specifically to have these kinds of conversations because we thought that there was a need for moving away from managing programs or administering programs to trying to solve problems within the larger organizations that we're a part of. And so APPAM has matured to the point where we can actually confront some of these difficult questions about ethics and others. But we would invite, those of you who are over in Italy, and by the way, we have a conference in Spain in September, so join us in Madrid. Outside 1 hour outside of Madrid, because this is the kind of conversation we'd like to be kind of transformative of policy analysis throughout the world.
That is a wonderful note to end on, and I do hope that everybody plans a trip to sunny Segovia. Thank our panel, please, along with me. Wonderful conversation.